Hey, how's it going? Today I want to show you for a typical Linux server, in my case my remote Ubuntu server, how you can do user configuration, which allows you to do two things typically. One is to set your environment variables, to set your environment, and the other is to run a bunch of commands. So I'm going to show you now how you can do that for yourself as a user, for any other user. So the first configuration file we're going to look at, there's going to be two of them, but the first one is .profile. This is in your home directory, and as it says here, it's executed when you log on. Now this is where you put your environment variables, where you create, modify, configure, whatever you want to call it. In this case it's two out of the box. This is pretty typical. So your path environment variable gets appended with couple of directories. These directories, home bin and home local bin, are where you will typically put your personal executable files. Path is a very special environment variable. If you set this, it means that you can then run these files no matter which directory, where on the system you happen to be. These executable files or binaries will be accessible to you no matter where you are. So this is very, very typical, and you could edit this, you could add your own environment variable configuration in this file. .profile executed when you log on, so it's ready for you. I'll come back to this later, don't worry about that. So that was .profile. Now let's have a look at another file called bashrc. Now let me go to the top. This is executed for non-login shells. So imagine you're actually on a laptop running Linux or running like a Mac or something. Every time you launch a terminal window, you're already logged on, but every time you launch a terminal window, it will run this entire file. RC stands for run commands. So again, as I said, this is typical for personalization. So for example, you got like history configuration here. If I scroll down, you've got terminal personalization like colors and stuff like that. And another typical one, if I scroll down again, is aliases. So you got three aliases out of the box. If you type LL, it will do the equivalent of LS ALF, but you can add more here. You can edit these if you want. So again, that is personalization. If I scroll to the top again, bashrc is stored in your home directory. Many people will share these on the internet. If you go to GitHub and search for bashrc, you get inspiration from other people how they've personalized their environments. Me personally, I don't like to personalize it much. I know when I log onto a server, I want to be used to that default environment, so I typically don't personalize this much, but I do a little bit. So that's two files. Profile is when you log on, it sets the environment. bashrc is anytime you launch a shell after you're already logged on, and it will, every time it does that, run a bunch of commands according to your own preferences. Let's go back into .profile. I want to show you something. Now this part will make more sense, and what it says here is if bashrc exists, then run it. So when you log on, also run your personalization commands, and that's pretty handy. So that's just something to know. Another thing to know here is you may have heard also of bash profile, and all this means is, it says here, right, the .profile is not read if bash profile already exists. So you can override .profile with .bash_profile. When would you do that? Well, let's say you have several shells, bash, maybe ZSH, maybe some other shells. You may want to have a profile for each individual shell to override the default one. That's when you would do that. So that's just good to know. So profile and bashrc are the user configuration files for setting your environment and for running commands, which is typically what you want to do specifically as a user. But what if you want to set that on a system-wide level for all users? Then what you're going to do instead is, there's two places to do that. The first one I'm going to show you is to set the environment variables, and that would be done in etc environment. And you can see this is where that special environment variable that everybody has called path. This is where that was originally created, and it was created to say all the executable files that we would typically store in sbin or bin. Bin means binary. Then for every single user on this system, make sure they have access to these sort of system level executable files that are probably going to be used by everybody, including games and snapbin as well. And so this is set for every single user. This is where it originates in etc environment. This is where you would put them as well if you wanted to add any of your own configuration customizations. So that's the environment variables. Now what about running any commands? Well, you would do that elsewhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into cd etc profile.d, and I'm now going to run ls on shell files, shell scripts, and this is where you can set on a system-wide level, when somebody logs in, then these shell scripts should all run. And there's the great thing about this is what you do is for each use case you create a separate file. So to fix the locale, that's one. To set apps bin path or whatever, that's another. To do bash completion, then do it in here, etc., etc. So if you've got your own, you would create a new file. You wouldn't edit an existing file, give it an appropriate name, and make sure that it exists in this etc profile.d directory. And that's it. You now know how to set environment variables and run commands for the user. You know also how to do that for system-wide for all users as well. Of course, system-wide there's also other settings, not just the environment variables and running commands. There's a whole bunch of other settings as well, and typically they'll be stored in etc, but I just wanted to show you today where you can do that for the users and where you can also do the same on a system level. But don't forget, there's a whole bunch of other system settings too. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Take care.